Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us here for the Head of School Roundtable, January 13th. Give it a few minutes here just for the room to populate. We're sort of at the dinner hour, so hopefully you either finish your dinner or you're about to head into dinner. And we'll try to keep it brief tonight. I'm going to give it just another minute or two. We were hoping to have this roundtable in person, but I guess we're going to have to push that off until a little later in the school year. We're just going to give it another minute here. It's still just turned 6 o'clock, so people are going to join us as we go. As you're joining, I just wanted to note that we're going to have some time for questions at the end tonight. And so there are two ways to ask questions. You can either upload a question to the Q&A box, and you can do that just by typing it in. And we're the only ones that can see your question. So feel free to ask whatever. And you can also raise your hand, and we can call on you if, or I can call on you if you have your hand raised, and we can hear your voice. And if you want to share your video, we can do that as well. The chat room is not, the chat box is not open tonight. And then of course this webcast will be recorded and posted tomorrow as well. So feel free to add those questions as we go, and then I'll go through them towards the end. I start with this slide, our city on the hill. This is obviously there's some ancient history to the term our city on the hill, but it's also a line in our school song. And I share it now because in many ways we operate as a separate municipality here on top of the hill. We have a lot of people that we're responsible for, nearing 800 people, and we that's some of the reasons for our current policies and our efforts to keep everyone safe and healthy. And we have a wide range of people that we care for on this campus, including our students and our employees and their families and visitors and the like. So I wanted to start tonight by giving you an update on how things are going since we re-entered campus last week and the quiet period. So I wanted to start first with just some COVID-19 information, our dashboard for students. So since December 1st, 2021, so a little over a month ago, 116 of our students, nearly 22%, have tested positive for COVID-19. If you look back at the year and a half prior to that, since the pandemic began, the total number that had tested positive was a small portion of that. I don't know exactly the number, but you can count it on maybe 2 or 3 hands, the total number of students that had tested positive. So like the rest of the country and the rest of the world, we are part of the Omicron surge, and that is a pretty significant number of students. Now, most of those students tested positive prior to coming to campus, either during the HTerm or during the winter holiday recess, or during pre-arrival testing as we required. However, we have had 12 students who were cleared to enter campus and entered campus who tested positive for COVID after arriving. As I stated in my email to you all back, I think on December 30th, one of our goals was to keep as much COVID off campus as possible in the initial phase here of the quiet period, and then to do whatever we could to minimize transmission or spread on campus to a manageable rate. We were quite certain that we would not be able to prevent, especially Omicron, especially how transmissible it was. But I'm feeling pretty good about this number of 12 students at 2.3% of our total student body. So, I would rather it be a smaller number, but it's not as big as we could have feared. Right now, we have a total of 27 students who are currently isolating, and some of those are at the tail end of their isolation because they tested positive during the pre-arrival period. And some of them have just begun. So, the 12 students in the previous box there or circle there are just starting their isolation process. Most importantly, one of our primary goals was to prevent severe illness among our students and employees. And as of right now, none of our students who have tested positive for COVID-19 since December 1, or actually ever, have had any severe illness. Employees obviously play a big role in the success of the school. And so we're monitoring closely their COVID health because we want to avoid the disruption that comes with that. I think you see around the country different groups of teachers who are and employees that are causing schools to delay or go remote. And we are certainly being mindful of that as well. I'm aware of another boarding school that actually had to delay their arrival because they had so many of their dining hall staff were positive for COVID-19 and they couldn't feed their students. So we're keeping a close eye on this. So since December 1st, we've had 30 of our employees, or 11%, test positive for COVID-19. That's a little bit of a lower rate than our students. We currently have 17 of our employees isolating for COVID-19, and 7 of those 17, or just under 10% of our teaching faculty, are currently isolating with COVID-19. So that's actually a pretty significant number if you think about it. For our 7 full-time teachers who teach 4 sections with about 15 kids or 12 kids in each section, you're looking at 50 to 60 students per teacher that we have to get coverage for. Unfortunately, our faculty is really good at supporting each other, and we've been using some of our technology to facilitate that, but it's not an insignificant number. And as soon as a few of them come back, we've had a few of them go back out. So it is a bit of a revolving door there. And again, like our students, none of our employees have reported severe illness or hospitalization. So we're grateful for that as well. So with that in mind, we've met last night, our COVID response team, to determine what our campus protocols are going to be going forward. And we've decided to just make a 1-week decision starting on Monday, January 17th. We don't think that it's that we should be projecting beyond a week. We're watching local rates and other information very closely, and we wanted to be thoughtful 1 week at a time. Hopefully we'll be at some point be able to remove all of these restrictions and just go forward that way. We're not quite ready to do that yet. So for the next week, starting on Monday, we are going to continue remote learning in a synchronous Zoom access using OWL cameras and recordings if a student is not on the same time zone or is not feeling well enough to participate in synchronous classes. And so that is for any student who is remote next week, whether it's for quarantine or isolation or for any other reason that they've been allowed to be a remote student or required to be a remote student, they will have synchronous access. That may change after next week if our numbers are reduced, but because we have a significant number of students who are off campus, we wanted to give them that access. I didn't show the number earlier, but in addition to the students who are isolating or quarantining for COVID-19, we have another 20 or so students who are off campus, mostly who are still delayed in returning, some international students and some other distant borders. And so, we have about 90% of our students back, but with 10% out, we wanted to continue the synchronous learning. We're going to keep our current modified schedule that we've been using for the last week and a half. That basically is the same schedule as our normal year with an extended period in the middle of the day for lunch and chapel. We will continue with buffet meals, and we're going to continue with a virtual chapel that's watched with each student's advisory twice a week. In fact, next week there's only one chapel because Monday is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and we have a special program for that. For weekend and extended leaves, we will have another closed. This weekend is closed, and the following weekend will also be closed. We will consider leaves. The dean's office will consider leaves under what we're calling basically highly special circumstances. That will be at the discretion of the dean. So students and parents can submit their leave request with the information of what makes it highly special or highly unusual. And the deans will evaluate whether that is indeed qualified for a leave for the weekend or longer. However, if a student does go on one of these leaves, there will be a reentry process where 3 days after, for the 3 days after whatever the leave was for, so if it was for some sort of sporting event or family event or a college visit or something like that, for those 3 days, the student would have to do an at-home quarantine so as to end any other exposures, take a COVID test, and then return, assuming that test is negative, return to campus once they receive those results. So it could be up to in some cases, a week delay before returning after the special event. So we are being pretty cautious about that still, as we've seen a lot of off-campus COVID as compared to on-campus COVID. We are allowing family visits to campus. So if you want to come see your children, please do. It's permitted for immediate family members, so parents, siblings, and if you are boosted or you have been COVID recovered, which I will talk about in 1 second, you may visit indoor locations. Otherwise, it will have to be outdoor locations. For any of family members, we're just not allowing any visits to the dormitory. Please go to our website to register for the visit. You can upload all your information there, and that will smooth out the arrival process. And please enter through the gatehouse on Beach Street, not the CFTA parking lot. We don't have an attendant there. So you can just come through the gatehouse and they'll wave you through if you've registered. If you haven't registered, it'll just be a little bit of a delay, and I know you'll want to see your children, so please do that. We are opening up our spectator policy for athletics. So all guests are welcome, whether you're a Hill family or a non-Hill family, and you can bring children, grandparents, cousins, friends, college coaches, whatever. However, you must have a primary vaccination series. So that's just either 1 shot of Johnson & Johnson or 2 shots of Moderna or Pfizer. You do not have to have a booster shot to visit for athletics. You can come with a negative COVID-19 test from within 24 hours prior to the game, or you are COVID recovered. So I should introduce that concept of COVID recovered. Under the CDC guidelines and Montgomery County guidelines, individuals who have had COVID and have recovered within the last 90 days have a bit of a pass for like some immunity and also a pass from surveillance testing and that sort of thing. So you have to be at least 10 days past your COVID illness, a documented COVID illness. So please bring a record of your positive test, and then within 90 days of that illness. So that's that. We will have separate fan sections for visitors, and we're asking our families to please not interact with our students either in the stands, or if you have children on the ice or on the court or what have you, please don't interact with them before, during, or after the game. The other thing, as I mentioned before, we are seeing a lot of off-campus COVID, especially as it relates to club sports and those kinds of activities. We are thus, for the next week, continuing the prohibition on club sports, whether that's for boarding students or day students, unless you take and are granted an extended leave, as I described above. So if you want to participate in club sports and similar activities, you can request that from the dean's office, and we will consider that request with the reentry process as I described. I think you all know by now that we are requiring the booster for all students, all eligible students, by February 1st. We had our campus booster clinic today. I think 159 students were boosted today. That brings us to about 85% of our students who have been boosted either here or prior to coming back to campus or on their independently. So there's still a couple weeks left for the remaining 15% to receive their booster shot. If you have any questions about that or need any assistance with that, please do be in touch with us at your earliest convenience. The sooner the better on that, obviously, because it does impact the health and wellness of our entire community. Our day student off-campus expectations, obviously we were in sort of a bit of a lockdown mode for our day students for the last week and a half. That was to parallel our policies for our boarding students, especially with rates being very, very high in Montgomery County right now. So we have relaxed that a little bit. We're allowing our day students to visit, again, what we're calling essential indoor locations where they can mask. places like the grocery store or church, or going into a restaurant to pick up takeaway food. But we are asking them to avoid crowded indoor spaces and indoor dining. So no indoor dining at restaurants, no movie theaters, no concerts, no airports, no public transportation, that sort of thing. We are relaxing that a little bit, but we are still quite nervous about those spaces where vaccination rates and booster rates and positivity are not known. And again, no indoor club sports or activities, similar types of activities are permitted. If you have a question about that, you can contact the Dean's office. A lot of you are asking about our exposure protocols when a student is either test positive or is a close contact. So we are updating those policies as well. I start here first by saying, we generally, on the whole, throughout the pandemic, have followed CDC guidance and Montgomery County requirements through the Office of Public Health. The CDC has issued some recent guidance. I'm sure you've all read about the 5-day isolation period if you're positive, plus a 5-day strict masking period. We have a couple of concerns about that. First of all, we are seeing quite a few people continue to test positive in the day 6 through 10 period. We are also seeing, we really feel that requirement was designed for essential workers and not as much for those who can isolate off campus, at home. And so we are just taking, for another week, we are going to take a little bit more precaution, and we are going to stick with the 10-day off-campus isolation period. If asymptomatic at the end of 10 days, the student can return to campus. They do not need to take a test. As long as they're asymptomatic, they can return to campus and full in-person participation. And as I said before, we are going to continue offering, at least for next week, the synchronous learning, so they're not missing out on their classes during that time period. If you are a non-household close contact and you are vaccinated or COVID recovered, and that is still just defined as the original vaccination series for right now, obviously booster counts too. But if you are vaccinated or COVID recovered, as I described before, you may remain on campus and in person, but that student would have to follow the MMT protocol, where they're monitoring their symptoms for 14 days, where they're masking in all circumstances, including any circumstances where we are not masking, and they are testing on certain days in that 10-day period. We are also permitting those who are household close contacts. So if the contact is in their home where there's continued exposure on a daily basis or has been continued exposure, those students can remain on campus as well, following the MMT protocol, plus a more significant testing regime where they would be testing on day 1, 3, and 5, a rapid antigen test in the morning, whether that's when they leave their dorm or when they come to campus as a day student. The one thing I didn't share here, I don't know why I forgot, but one big change is that we are going to allow our students who are involved in active co-curriculars, whether it's sports or theater or something similar to that, to not wear a mask during their active participation. So a student playing basketball can be unmasked while on the court, but while they're on the bench or in the locker room or something like, or on the van going to a game, they would have to wear a mask. The only exception to that is in our ice hockey programs. We're allowing those students to not have their masks on while they're on the bench, just because it's so difficult with a chin strap, a helmet, and hockey gloves to pull a mask up and down, and with such active substitutions. So we are trying, that's an area where we think we can take a little bit more risk, and that we think will benefit our students, and we're moving forward there. So I am going to pause there. and maybe take a few questions here, if that's okay, because I'm going to move on to the non-COVID world. And I see we have a couple of questions. So the first is, for the COVID testing that follows the 3-day at-home quarantine after weekend leaves, what type of test is required, and on what day does the test need to be taken? Will Hill conduct the COVID test upon the student's return? Thank you. So in most cases, if you're on a leave and you complete your leave activity, you'll do a 3-day home quarantine, which is enough time, we think, to see if there's been an incubation of illness. And then we asked our students to take PCR tests unless they are COVID recovered, in which case they would take an antigen test. And both of those would be taken at home on your own. And then you would return to campus once you had those results. So for PCR tests, that's usually 2 to 3 days. At least that's what it's running in some places right now. It depends on where you are. And then for a rapid test, you can usually get those much more quickly. And so that could, if you're COVID recovered, you could come back more quickly. So that's the first question. The next question is not a question. It just said that they're a little bummed that there was no Ted Lasso-esque intro tonight. I think that are referring to our Ted Lasso film at the beginning of the school year. In any event, any other questions on COVID protocols, COVID data? All right, I've got a couple of questions piling up here. Good. And feel free to raise your hand. Happy New Year, Mr. Lehman. Regarding the 12, Happy New Year to you. Regarding the 12 students who tested positive on campus, is this number from one house or from different houses? I assume you mean dormitories. It is definitely across our dormitories. It's not in one particular dormitory, and it includes some day students as well. We have one dormitory that we think has a little bit higher rates than others, and we are probably going to be a little bit more strict in that particular dormitory. And if it happens in other dormitories where we see a cluster or an uptick, we would do the same. So right now our dormitories are doing pretty well. The student morale in the dorms is pretty good. They're allowed to obviously be in their own room. They're allowed to visit other people's rooms. We're asking them to be masked when they go into another student's room. They're obviously allowed to be in the common rooms. So it's a little less restrictive than it was during the HTerm. And I think our students are appreciating that. Question, my son was required to have a physician's note to return to participating in sports. While we were able to get one, she commented that this was an unnecessary strain on the healthcare system given the current pandemic. It was difficult to get the appointment. Can this requirement be dropped? That's a great question. I don't have the answer offhand, but I will certainly refer that to Dr. Spencer. Unfortunately, she wasn't available tonight. So we can check with our athletic trainers. We do have a return to play protocol, but that's been going fairly smoothly. I haven't heard that particular concern before. Next question, who makes up the COVID response team, and do you seek outside expert input? It's a great question. Our COVID response team includes a number of administrators here at the school, obviously myself, Dr. Spencer, our medical director, Ari Baum, our dean of students, our two academic deans, Katie Hudak and Jared Courtney, as well as Sylvia Rodriguez Vargas, our associate head of school, and I am missing someone. Seth Eilberg, our director of athletics and co-curricular activities. We, of course, seek outside expert input, but we also rely heavily on Dr. Spencer's expertise. She also spends a lot of time on the phone and on Zoom calls with other medical directors at other peer schools, as well as weekly calls with Montgomery County Public Health Department. We read a lot of information. We follow studies. We are carefully connected to a number of different guidance portals as well. So I think we do a pretty good job. We've also been doing it for almost 2 years. And so I speak with a lot of other heads of school and we share a lot of information. So that's the answer there. We do have a hand up. Let's see who we have here. All right, let's, the Shorts, they always raise their hand. Hello, Shorts.
Good evening, Mr. Lehman.
How are you?
We're staying positive and testing negative.
Living the life.
Good. What can I do for you tonight?
Question, what does endemic COVID, as you look into the future, what does endemic COVID look like for Hill? How do we get there? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think we're getting close to that inflection point. We don't think we're quite there yet, both in actuality and in perception, sort of intellectually. I mean, there are still a large portion of our community that is concerned about contracting COVID, even though most studies show that it's mild illness in all, and especially in young people, especially those who are double or triple vaccinated. But the rates are pretty concerning in our region, and we also just have the challenge of we have limited resources in terms of how students recover, where they recover, and that sort of thing. So we are certainly hopeful for that moment where we can treat this as just any other kind of illness. And we're doing some things that I didn't mention. We're streamlining our close contact. We're streamlining some of our communications around this, just so we can manage it. Every case that we have here has a lot of layers. A lot of people need to be notified. Parents have to come and get their child. We have to do additional testing. We have to monitor. It's just a lot. But I hope that within the next few weeks, if not the next month, that we are there.
Thank you.
Sure.
And thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good night. Okay. A question, why is Hill not sharing weekly COVID data anymore about number of tests and cases, et cetera? That transparency was helpful and built trust. Thanks for the question. We did not share it this fall because, quite frankly, we had 0 cases. I think we had one student case and one employee case in the entire fall period. As we started to see an increase in COVID in the HTerm, I was in touch with families on a pretty regular basis. I think I sent out 3 or 4 emails in that 2.5 week period, indicating how many positive cases we had and how many tests we had done and the percentages and that sort of thing. We have only been back now for just over a week, and I just presented that data here. We are thinking about a dashboard, but it's also, with the numbers being where they are, we also want to be thoughtful about what is the actual information that people need, whether it's total number of tests, total number of positive cases, total number of quarantines, and that sort of thing. And it's also, again, one more layer that our small team has to do. It was not very cumbersome to do when we were tracking a very small number of cases and just kept track of the number of tests. But there's a lot more to keep track of right now. And what we're mostly interested in is disruption of education and activities, and preventing severe illness. So I will try to keep you informed, and that was the purpose of tonight. Question, thanks for all your hard work to keep kids healthy. And second, are college and universities visiting the school this year, or would they be virtual only? They have been visiting in the fall. I think most of the visits right now have been virtual. I presume that after a certain point, either this winter or spring, they will go back to visiting us in person, but they have been suspended to a certain extent. I don't know, I haven't heard whether colleges are allowing visits in their admissions process. They probably are doing like we are doing, which is requiring vaccination or testing for admission visits to the Hill. The next question, have you considered doing all of your required testing, PCR and antigen at the school, considering the difficulty obtaining tests in the community? Yeah, thanks for that question. So one thing I didn't mention is that we are going to stop full community surveillance testing next week. And we will continue with symptomatic testing, and we're going to be testing some high-risk co-curricular groups, groups that have a lot of contact, physical contact with other teams, or play a lot of games. So we're greatly reducing the amount of tests that we're doing on campus. That's not your question, though. Your question is, are we, it's hard to get a test, and we're requiring tests for like returning to campus and that sort of thing. We can accommodate some of that in terms of our antigen testing. We do have a pretty good reserve of those kinds of tests. So if you're local and you can't find a test and you need one to come back, we can help arrange that. Our PCR testing is quite limited on campus. It's quite expensive, and it's also very limited in terms of the amount of tests that we can do at any given time. But certainly if a student is really unable to find something, we can try to accommodate that. We couldn't do that at the beginning of the school year because it would have been, or at the beginning of the winter term, that would have been 475 or 500 PCR tests, and that would have taken us weeks at the rate that we were able to do it here on campus. So I understand that it was difficult to get testing. We anticipated that, which is why we gave a lot of advance notice. I know that didn't necessarily help in all cases, but we tried our best. Okay. We all know by now that the vaccine does not limit spread, but only serves to lessen symptoms. We also know that the Omicron variant is much less serious, but much more transmissible. When do we get back to normal? You're going to have positive tests for a long, long time. It's the common cold, and it's time we move forward, in my opinion. I think that's similar to the question that we got on the phone, where the sense is that we're moving towards endemic. I agree with that. I don't agree with the fact that the vaccination does not limit the spread, especially with boosters of COVID-19. We are seeing a significant reduced rate of on-campus COVID spread. Even though we're in a congregate setting, we are seeing a very low rate compared to the outside world. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we're 98% vaccinated and we're now 85% boosted. I know there's controversy over that, but it certainly is limiting spread in our particular circumstance. We hope that it will become similar to the common cold. There are quite a few hospitalizations right now across the country and across the world because there are so many cases, even though it's milder. And we don't yet fully know whether this is the last variant, but that's our hope. That's what we're moving towards. We are moving towards normalcy. We had a very normal fall. I hope that within a week or two, we will be closer to normalcy, and we can continue to provide a good balance between a robust program and balanced health. Sorry, I'll take one more question here and then move on to some of my other slides. And then if we have some more time, we can come back to it. I think the last question here is, are home PCR tests accepted? The answer to that is yes. Those are usually the ones where you take it at home and send it in and you get the results several days later. We really prefer tests that have a timestamp on them that are administered by a lab, as opposed to a home rapid test, which are a little bit less reliable in terms of the date and that sort of thing. So that's that. All right, let me move on to a few other things. We are not just COVID all the time here at the Hill School. I wanted to just share some basic information about the HTerm, which we wrapped up before the winter holiday recess. It's really, for us, it's about how we combine liberal arts with authentic learning experiences. And a few years ago, we changed the vision statement for the Hill School to incorporate authentic learning experiences within our liberal arts curriculum to assist our students in really orchestrating positive change throughout their life. And we weren't 100% sure how to do that, but the HTerm became our major method there. And most of you know we had a 6-week HTerm last year when we closed campus for the winter months. This year we decided to do it mostly on campus, and it was a great success. Most of you know, our students had choices in terms of what they could do. 82% of our students remained on campus, and we offered 45 different courses, and with 9 of them running multiple sessions of those courses. We actually had I think our initial course catalog had over 70 courses, and our students selected 45 of those courses. Each student had 2 courses. At the same time, 132 of our students completed internships or independent studies off campus. And 34 of our students were on campus but had 1 course and 1 independent study or group independent study here on campus. So our kids were all over the country, all over the world, and also right here in Pottstown. And we enjoyed a really fantastic HTerm showcase on the last evening. And our students who are doing internships and independent studies are also submitting updates on that. So far, we've had a very good response. Our surveys of our students and teachers has been very positive. And so we're working on HTerm 3.0 for next year. And we'll get information to all of our students and families about that soon enough. I know a lot of you are interested in admission at Hill. In fact, in about 20 minutes, I think there is an admissions webinar that will follow this one. And some of you have younger children or friends and family members who are applying to Hill. We're once again doing quite well with our admissions process. We are about 4% ahead of our interviews over our 5-year average. We have seen growth in that area, including a record year last year in terms of the total number of interviews and applications. Applications are due at the end of this month, so we don't have a firm count on applications, but it generally is anyone who interviews also applies. So exciting to see us 4% ahead there. Our international interviews are 9% ahead, and it's not shown here, but our in-person interviews over last year are something like 30 or 40% ahead, maybe even more than that, than last year, since we've been able to have so many more in-person interviews, which is terrific. Oh, there it is. It says it right there. A 55% increase in on-campus interviews. Sorry, missed that. We've held a ton of virtual receptions, both independently and with other schools, and we've had over 2,000 attendees join in on those sessions. So the application deadline's coming up. If you still haven't had an interview for your child or someone you know, please do contact the admissions office right away. We are still doing in-person interviews with some restrictions, and we still offer Zoom interviews as well. One of the things I also like to share on these is just an update on fundraising at Hill. I think it speaks a lot to the success of the school in recent years, as well as our ability to improve our program and our campus, and what is attracting students to the school and hopefully providing a first-rate experience. So we have been running the Strength of All campaign for about 6.5 years now, and the goal of that campaign was to raise $175 million through a variety of different initiatives and different buckets. And so far, we just passed a $150 million mark on January 1st, and we're climbing. So we're hopeful to complete that campaign as soon as possible. And as you know, a lot of those funds have gone into our facilities, into our programs, into our endowment, and into our operations as well. So I'm proud of that. Many of you participate in the Hill Fund and the Parent Fund, which help to keep the lights on, as they say. The Hill Fund makes up about 20% of our operating budget on an annual basis, and about 10% of our operating budget on an annual basis. And we've seen tremendous growth there, both from our alumni and our parents. We are currently 19% ahead of where we were on this day last year. And last year was our all-time record for the Hill Fund and total giving as well. We we raised nearly 4.6 million in the Hill Fund and Parent Fund, and we raised $27 million overall as a school, which we were able to pour right back into our program. This year, we've raised $3.65 million in the Hill Fund and Parent Fund to date, as of I think it was the end of December, maybe a little bit more recently than that. That was January 1st, and that we've also raised nearly $16 million in total giving for the school. Last but not least, just want to make sure you're aware of some dates ahead. I don't need to go through that, but if you want to take a quick picture of that screen, we can take a few more questions after that. A few highlights on there, the upcoming instrumental concert and winter vocal concert. Hopefully we'll be allowed to have outside guests for those. Probably just like whatever our policies are for athletics will be the same for those, which, as I said before, are opening up. Love Dot, our theatrical performance, will be held on March 4th through the 6th. We'll have our spring recess. We have re-enrollment deadline coming up on April 1st. We will hopefully have a spring long weekend that will be back in commencement, and then underformers departing campus on June 2nd. So with that, let's take a few more questions. We have, 10 or 15 more minutes here, and I'm happy to take as many questions as we can squeeze in. So this seems to be more of a comment. We think the HTerm is fantastic. Glad to see it continue onward. Thank you. I agree. Would you please review and explain the school's approach to testing, on campus or at-home antigen testing for COVID recovered students? The CDC recommends against testing for 90 days post-viral positive test, but it appears that we will still be testing these students. Is it a requirement for either return to campus or is a return from approved leave request? So that is accurate. We have a 90-day COVID recovered policy, which impacts a number of our policies. So we are trying to, those students will not be involved in surveillance testing, and they will not be required to take a PCR test. And that is because the PCR test is much more sensitive, as I understand it, than the antigen tests, and you can continue to test positive for weeks and months after being positive for COVID-19, which is basically sort of a false positive because it's just a small, minute amount of COVID in your body. So the reason we are requiring a antigen test is because there are still a small number of breakthrough cases for those who are COVID recovered. And we are concerned about when those students are off campus interacting in the big wide world where COVID rates are very, very high right now. We are asking them to take an antigen test to return. That's also to return after you are during the initial infection. So for those 10 days, we will be using that to determine that you can come back if we did it any earlier. So we're waiting 10 days and saying no test for anybody, but we may move closer to a 5-day isolation, in which case we would still do an antigen test because the antigen test will not generally show up as positive if you have recovered from COVID-19. That's the answer there. Please clarify the mask requirement during a sport or activity. Well, that's going to be clarified to our athletes and other co-curricular students from their coaches and from our athletic director. But essentially, while actively participating in sports on campus that are supervised, so organized sports, not pickup sports, a student will not need to wear a mask during the game or practice. So again, using basketball as an example, if you're out on the court and playing, whether it's practice or a game, no mask. If you're on the bench, you're in the stands for some reason, you're a manager, you're a coach, you're in the locker room, you're on a van, you do mask. in our opinion, that time is no different than when you're in the classroom, and we are still masking in the classroom, at least for the next week. So that is our policy for the next week, and that will actually start on Friday with our weekend games. Are grandparents able to visit on campus at some point this year? Yes, I think we allowed grandparents to visit this fall. I may have missed that. Right now, for the next week, we're limiting it to immediate family, but hopefully we'll be able to open up our visitor policy to be anyone who would like to come to campus. We should get there soon. Based on general statistics in the outside world, there are people that do not believe in vaccination. Do you have that problem on campus? And if so, how do you handle those cases? Well, I think, as you know, we have we require vaccination and now boosters by February 1, and I foresee that being the case going forward. We have a fairly limited exemption policy, which has resulted in 2% of our community is unvaccinated for medical reasons, religious or otherwise, that we've been granted an exemption. I have, we speak to those families and make sure they understand the risk of having that exemption, and they have some more stringent policies as it relates to quarantining and isolating, and that is the risk and I guess expectation or burden that they carry for having an exemption. I spent a lot of time speaking to those families over the holiday period because I feared that with Omicron being as transmissible as it was, that it would be much more disruptive to our unvaccinated students than our vaccinated students. And we have seen that come to fruition. They have to quarantine off campus when they have a close contact, whereas most of our students can remain on campus. And that has happened. And we also are seeing a much higher rate of our unvaccinated students testing positive for COVID-19. I do think that, again, I have our little world here to base my data off of, and we are seeing higher rates in unvaccinated students and lower rates in vaccinated and boosted. I know my child wore a mask in yoga today. Is this rule effective next week? Yes, so this is the rule for co-curricular activities starting next week. I did say, though, that the masking the change in the masking policy for co-curriculars will start effectively on Friday. We have some games over the weekend, and we thought that was an area where we could start to make some movement. How do you plan to keep morale up for day students when they are not allowed to stay on campus past their commitments, but they are cut off from doing anything outside of their home and cannot even have visitors come to their home? If there were activities for them at Hill, it would help them to stay connected to the Hill family and would help to keep them within the Hill bubble. Thank you for that point. I don't know that we've actually discussed that particular part of the day student policy. I will talk with our committee. It was a long meeting. My guess would be that we will allow day students to continue stay into the evenings past their last commitment for dinner and the like. And then we have been allowing day students to be here on the weekends for weekend activities. I think we have been doing that to some extent, and certainly that will continue to be more. I understand that it's difficult for day students, but I also think that our policies are generally mirroring the policies that we have for our boarding students. So, with the exception of basically sleeping here, the day students have been here for most of the time. And, the quiet period is a little bit different because we're just trying to re-enter from 30 countries and 30 states with 535 students. So thanks for understanding that. All right, no matter what flack you are taking, please know that you and your team are doing an amazing job in a really tough environment. An amazing in-person academic experience is the essence of Hill, and nothing trumps that. Thank you for all you're doing for the benefit of our students. Sure, thank you, that's right. I will invest in a few flak jackets to wear. I just generally wear a Kevlar blazer around, it's okay. The CDC, differentiates positive tests versus contagiousness and says that people are contagious 1 to 2 days before symptoms and 2 days after. And so the CDC says that 5 days after symptoms leave plenty of cushion. I hope you might reconsider the 10-day quarantine, which is detrimental to our children's education and mental health. Also, when you say you have higher rates of unvaccinated kids are getting COVID, are you talking about the one kid during HTerm divided by the very low number of unvaccinated kids as the denominator, or have there been more kids since break? Thank you so much for everything. We are aware of the CDC policies. As I said before, we use them as a baseline, and we consider our particular context of being a congregate setting. There are places where we cannot mask on campus, dining hall, dormitories, and now athletics. And so it's really difficult to do the 5 days plus 5 days. We also, basing our isolation period after symptoms is a really tricky thing, because when someone tests positive, they sometimes misremember when their symptoms began. And so this is a conservative approach, but we have a very close-knit congregate setting, and we have high expectations for our administration of our health policy. I understand that it's very difficult to be off campus and remote, and we certainly are trying to balance all of that with everything else. And we do hope that we can move to a shorter isolation period soon with some testing to return and that sort of thing. But it's quite complicated for us. And in terms of unvaccinated kids getting COVID at a higher rate, I'm not talking about one kid during the HTerm. We actually had 12 students test positive during the HTerm, and we have had more kids test positive since the break. I shared that at the beginning of we've had now over 112 students test positive since the HTerm, including those 12. And we've had about 12 students test positive since returning to campus, and a disproportionate number of those students over the denominator have been unvaccinated. So yeah, I'm just giving you the data as we see it here. I'm not talking about the wider world, but we are seeing those rates differently here. Will there be any limitations such as traveling or other activities for students during spring recess? I would say that's too early to say, but hopefully not. We do typically have spring trips. We are trying to be cautious about those. We don't want to overextend ourselves only to have to cancel that. I'm just going to take.
I think we're just about wrapping up.
I am wrapping up. So
thank you.
Well, this is a good note to end on. On a serious note, thank you in the Hill for all you're doing. We were choosing a boarding school for our son 1 year ago, and we were absolutely blown away by Hill's response to the COVID crisis. You've reinforced our feelings from last year. Thank you all. I know the reason that we have to go is because the admissions event will start momentarily, and we would have a big party line here because it's the same Zoom link. If you have any other questions, do feel free to send me an email, send Dr. Spencer an email, and we'll get back to you just as soon as we can. A full email will go out tomorrow with a link to all of our updated policies for next week. You can look at that sometime tomorrow, probably by midday. Thanks, everybody. I hope you're doing well, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.